Hello, peoples. Okay, I'm trying to get back into the swing of things. It's been almost like a week since I've done a video, so to make it up to all my watchers, this is gonna be kind of I guess I'll say special video, because it's gonna be in like 5 different parts. Uh, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but I definitely mentioned it to myself that I wouldn't be doing a video on biomech, and I mean like where you start off with 3 factories and it looks like you're doing mech, but then you transition into bio until more games were out, and more games have come out. There are quite a few examples now, so it's going to be very interesting analysis. It's going to be about why I think this is the best unit composition. This should be the future of TvZ. It's the best. It's the best. It's the best. That's 3 more reasons right there. And yeah, and so like just the different spins that top level Terran players have taken on this kind of style and how it reflects on the gameplay and what the Zerg's best reaction is, what the Terran's reaction should be, and all that good stuff. So get some food, get abstraction. This is going to be a pretty long episode. So without further ado, we go back to the root of where this all started, Ground Zero, the life versus fantasy game played almost. It's February 24th, it's May 18th, so this game was played March, April, May, almost 3 months ago in a week, which is absolutely mind-blowing how old this style is and how good it can still be. Like it's even though it's 3 months old, it's still completely relevant today in this matchup, and yeah, just as strong as ever. So the reason why I didn't want to do a video of this build in the first place when it first came out was I didn't know how gimmicky it was and how like solid it could be. But after watching a couple other biomech videos and starting to kind of understand the goal behind this, I've started to realize that the person who made this build, iloveoov, is just miles ahead of like every single other StarCraft 2 player in terms of like he's basically like a visionary for the future, and should this is really going to change the future of TvZ in my opinion, because bio is really predictable. It can be crushed by mass mutalisks, or it can't be crushed by mass mutalisks, but mass mutalisks is a very good counter against bio play, mostly because there's no real good way to deal with like not 50, like 20 to 30 mutalisks flying into your base, killing a bunch of shit, then going out, and then going to like bouncing in between bases, and you're just scrambling around trying to like stay alive and not take damage, and all the while it's frustrating because you can't even kill the mutalisks. As soon as they see your units, they just fly away. That can cause a lot of rage and QQ on ladder. So what we see here in this game, though, is his response is a mass mutalisk build, and it's kind of just like playing against a standard bio play, and then he transitions. Yeah, he transitions everything as if he was playing against bio play. So if he was playing against a like just bio play with Thors mixed in, I think he would have won this game. But since fantasy opened up the way he did, and just how he uses his army, it just it's just mind blowing what he can accomplish. And like life, he didn't really make any big mistakes. This is probably the first time he's seen this build, so everything he was doing was like as good as it could have been without having seen this build before. And even if he's seen this build before, and we'll see what other players choose to do later on when we analyze the other biomech games and their responses, is that there's not really one response to counter this kind of play, because as a Terran player, you're going to have mech available to you off of the 3 factories, and you're also going to have bio available to you as well. And that kind of gives you, it just unlocks every single unit basically that the Terran can build, which is kind of a scary thing. And it really like means that as long as you have the right unit composition, you are never going to die to the Zerg player, and you are always going to have a better unit composition. Or as long as you have the right unit composition, your unit composition is always going to win. And we'll see this here, because like I said earlier, Life is going to be doing a Mask Mutalisk build, and he kind of like just sticks to Muta Baneling. And I think against a regular bio army with Hellbats, Thors, Marauders, and Marines, this would have crushed it. But the not synchronization, the I guess harmony between the siege tanks and the Thors is what really makes this unit composition extremely powerful, because the siege tanks are able to deal with the banelings, and the Thors are able to deal with the Mutalisks. With just bio siege tank styles, you don't really have enough anti-air available to you to shut down siege tanks, or I mean to shut down the Mutalisks, like prevent them from just flying over, sniping a siege tank, and then going out. And then you just lost a siege tank for like a Mutalisk, and that really sucks. But with Thors here in the mix, it makes it nearly impossible to do that as the Zerg player, because you have that really long range, I think they're called javelin missiles, and they do a crap ton of damage against Mutalisks. The important upgrade here is the +2 attack on your mech, because that's what that is what it allows. That's what allows. Oh, it doesn't sound right at all. Basically, +2 attack means you can 2-shot Mutalisks with Thors from 3-shotting, and because Thor's range is so big, but its attack is so slow, 2-shotting Mutalisks is a pretty big deal. And we'll see here, again, later in this game, also a cool thing Fantasy does, using Medivacs to kind of boost his Thors to deal with the Mutalisks. So it's essentially Thors stimmed, like at the speed of stim, being able to defend Mutalisks. So it's really, really powerful, as we'll see later in the game. But right now, okay, so right now, Fantasy opened up Hellion Banshee. It's a pretty standard opener. You can either transition into bio afterwards, or you can transition into mech. Both of the transitions are very doable at the highest levels of play. One thing to note here is that Fantasy is only getting 1 armory right now, rather than getting 2 armories. Because you don't really need the vehicle plating against anything, especially if you're just making siege tanks and Thors. Like obviously vehicle plating, the armor upgrade, helps against Mutalisks, but you'll have Marines as well to back the Thors up, and the Marines will be super upgraded, and they don't do very well against, or Mutalisks don't do very well against 3/3 Marines. And yeah, and siege tanks, I mean, if your siege tanks are getting attacked, you're doing something wrong. They should never be attacked. They should always be in the back lines just firing away. And if your siege tanks are getting attacked, then you're just not doing the right kind of an engagement. They should never be exposed like that. So it makes sense that you don't need to get vehicle armor. The only reason you would get it is for a sky tech transition, but you don't really need a sky tech transition until the really big hive units come out and the base starts, or the map starts getting mined out. Otherwise, the Zerg player, if they still have bank left, they can make a unit composition that can just counter the Sky Terran, and that's not very good. Because Sky Terran is probably the most expensive army you can make. Battle cruisers are very expensive. Alright, so Fantasy just scanned the natural, so he sees a layer tech, and he didn't see the Spire, but based on the fact that he sees a bunch of speedlings, he knows that they're 1-1 right now. It's safe to assume that he's going to be going for Spire. And I really hate this right here. Like, yeah, ha ha ha, foreigners. But it cuts off an important part of the video, because as soon as they zoom back, we catch the tail end of this. An overseer flying in to kind of scout what Fantasy is doing. And Fantasy here, he made that tech lab on the barracks, and then he floated it as soon as the overseer started coming through. If Fantasy had started, like, so just if you look at that, and then I'll go right before this unfortunate screenshot. So we see the tech lab being built on the barracks, and the barracks is right over there. And the tech lab just finishes right now. Fantasy has enough money for Stimman. Oh! We don't know what's going to happen. But pretty sure that Fantasy lifted up the barracks to just kind of like delay scouting this kind of bio transition as long as possible. So right now, everything looks completely normal, and one thing Fantasy did that's pretty cool is that even though he's getting double upgrades, his engineering bays are oddly placed as well. So there's an engineering bay right over there next to the armory, and there's another engineering bay over there. So Life isn't even going to see two engineering bays at the same time if he gets a full scout out on the base. And he's going to see an armory not making upgrades yet, but he sees 3 factories, he sees another tech lab, so like you could pretty much assume that there's going to be 2 more factories put down, and he sees a starport with a reactor. Boom. Mech, 100%. So now Life is going to be thinking, what am I going to do versus Mech? And what he does is he sticks to Roach Ling and tries to get a little bit of damage done. He doesn't really switch into the masked mutalisks until, like, it's okay, I'll hold off on that because he does a very smart thing, but Fantasy also counts for him doing that as well, and you don't see it enough on ladder. Usually, like, you show your tech as soon as possible, and then your opponent starts making a counter to it. That's not what Life did. So now the stim finally starts. Have no idea if it was delayed or what the timing is. I guess I don't think there's really a set timing. It's this build is based, or this style is based more off of having the right unit composition. As we can see, Fantasy is starting to make 2 siege tanks. He's starting to add his barracks count up. He still hasn't started +1 vehicle weapons. I don't think he really needs that right now because he hasn't seen any mutalisks. He also is going to be spending a lot of money pretty soon, or a lot of gas on medevacs. I mean, I guess there's no reason for him not to get it right now. He does have the money, but what I like him doing here is how fast he starts his medevacs. I'm pretty sure like all of the other biomech games that I've watched this weekend was a really delayed emphasis on the medevacs, and I didn't like that because not only does it make the bio part of this style weaker, because you can't heal up your bioforce after they stim. You can't do multiple drops with medevacs and like a bioforce, which is very notorious for doing a ton of damage and then picking up and then zooming out. So that's like a really aggressive factor that's limited if you're not getting medevacs really fast. And you also don't have a big enough medevac count to kind of like lift Thors up to stop mutalisks later on. So getting this medevac count up early is a really good decision by Fantasy. And so he's clearing creep right here, which I like. When Flash played against Sulky on this very same map doing a similar build, one thing Flash didn't do was account for any of the creep spreads. So Fantasy, he just scanned right there to stop creep spread from coming like towards this base and to just limit it. Of course, Life can replant the tumors, but it still takes time and the creep recedes during that time. So that scan is a very important scan in slowing down the Zerg player. If you were playing mech, you normally wouldn't be doing You normally wouldn't care about creep tumors that much, but since this has a bio aspect towards it, you can't. The same rule applies where you can't push onto bio or onto creep with your bio force. So limiting the creep is a very important factor. And so since Fantasy has two medevacs out really fast, just put the Thors in them, and it gives the Thors an insane amount of mobility. So right now, if Mutalisks did come to attack any base of Fantasies, he could boost towards the natural and defend that fine. He could boost towards the main and defend that fine, or he can just stay here. So these Thors really give a lot of mobility to an otherwise immobile unit. And like the reason why Thors are so immobile is because they deal so much damage. So making them really mobile really makes a Thor a much powerful unit. And Fantasy, he's taking a pretty fast fourth base as well, which I like. One thing he does here, he scans. He's looking for a text transition, if it's going to be Swarm Hosts, if it's going to be Roach Hydra, if it's going to be Mutalisks. He doesn't necessarily care if it's going to be a Hive. He just because he's going to push out at kind of a anti-hive timing regardless. He just needs to have the right unit composition to do so. So he scans there. He doesn't see anything, which is kind of unfortunate. So what does that do? He doesn't add any more turrets yet. He doesn't really push out either. He's not really doing anything. He's just kind of building up an army and getting ready to max out. The one thing that he does do is he scans some more creep over here, which I like. It gets rid of some tumors. Even though he loses his Hellion Force, I think getting rid of the creep, especially this is like happening a minute or two before he's actually going to move out. So getting rid of that before actually moving out, and then like moving out and having no creep there, I think is really, really good prep, or like just that's really good play by Fantasy. And now we see him scanning again at the same location, basically. Kind of the reinforcement rally point where Life is going to be making units, and he gets kind of lucky and he sees he sees 4 Mutalisks, and like Life was pulling up Mutalisks. He wanted to wait as long as possible before kind of like doing this mass Mutalisk switch and try to catch Fantasy off guard. So now that Life has been scouted, his Mutalisks gonna go start wrecking some havoc. And immediately, Fantasy, now since he's seen Mutalisks, he adds on some more Thors. I think he's gonna go up to about 6 here. And he basically makes a couple more turrets. And apply turrets generously against Mutalisks, because turrets are really good against Mutalisks. So right now, Life has no idea that there's a bio aspect towards this. It just looks like a standard mech play. And now, as we see here, Fantasy maxing out that Hellion Force that got cleaned up, kind of trading units away that aren't that great for units that are a lot better, that go well with the unit composition, such as Marines and Marauders, to clear this creep for this push. We can see that coming into effect now. And so Life, now he finally sees that there's bio going on, so he's kind of like in trouble right now. Fantasy scans again to see what kind of unit composition Life has. He sees only Lings and he only sees Mutalisks. Life immediately throws down a Baneling Nest because he needs Banelings to clear up this kind of a bio force. But other than that, it looks like a pretty normal game. To Life, that is. Because he sees a bunch of bio units. If you probably clicked on the bios so that he knows that the Marines and Marauders are 1-1 right now. And what he's doing now is he's essentially playing against just a regular bio kind of style. He has Mask Mutalisks, he's making a Baneling Nest, and he's going to be going Muta-Baneling into Infestor Ultra Baneling into Broodlords and Corruptors. And we'll see how that works out for him, why that doesn't work out for him, and what kind of unit compositions Fantasy makes to counter those. So he's moving out now, and right now there's literally nothing Life can do to engage into this army. If we take a look at it, he has, I think Fantasy has like 4 medevacs, he has 2, 3, 4, 5 siege tanks, and like 3 or 4 Thors over here. Not to mention this insane bioforce of Marines, Marauders, Hellbats. So at the current unit composition Life has, and he's maxed out as well, the best option for Life is to do a counterattack, which he does right now. And Fantasy knows this, so he has a Siege Tank, he has a Thor, and he has a Bioforce. And his main army is pretty close by as well. So as soon as he sees this little counterattack going through, he immediately unsieges and goes back. Like he knows how important it is to like reinforce this part of the army because it's so small. So he even stims his units forward to get there as fast as possible. So Life sees that he can't do a counterattack, so he is just gonna back up. Basically, he's just trying to buy time for the Baneling Nest to finish and for him to get Baneling speed as fast as possible. We'll see in the Flash versus Sulky game, Sulky had a Baneling Nest on time, and as a result was able to engage this push a lot faster. So now, Fantasy, he's going to be denying this base. It's a really great map for Siege Tanks because Siege Tanks, like on the low ground, can hit the hack tree on the high ground. And if it was just Siege Tanks and Bio, kind of like a more Bomber-esque style, these Mutalisks would have been able to just fly over the Siege Tanks and pick them off without having to, like, they can clump up, pick off a Siege Tank, then fly out. But because these Thors are here, it prevents the Mutalisks from even touching these Siege Tanks. Fantasy's not even going to try to attack those Siege Tanks. And so yeah, this base gets cleaned up mostly because Fantasy isn't able, or Life isn't able to engage against this kind of an army because he doesn't have Banelings yet. So now his Banelings are out. He's making a bunch of Banelings actually, because that's pretty much the only way to clean this up, is to use the Banelings to try to kill as many anti-air as possible and having the Mutalisks clean everything else up. And once again, Life is going for another counterattack, and he immediately backs up. He's doing these counterattacks to buy time because he doesn't have Baneling speed yet. He's just waiting for Baneling speed basically. And so even though these counterattacks look pretty scary and Fantasy doesn't look like he has that much of an army to defend against them, Life doesn't want to trade away his units. And that's kind of just, it speaks to his skill level about how good he is. Like, these counterattacks are just completely fake outs, and what they're doing is forcing Fantasy to kind of move back to alleviate the pressure that his insanely buff army is applying, and to just buy time for Life to get the right kind of units out. As we see here, on this map, like obviously this kind of a strategy is going to change for different maps, but we see that Life is currently on 4 bases, and Fantasy just denied his 5th, and Fantasy is on 4 bases. So as a Terran player that is on even bases with the Zerg player, that's always a good position for the Terran player, because mules make each base a lot more valuable because income rises significantly. So now we get into the kind of stage where Life has a really big Mutalisk ball. He's going to be trying to bounce around and do a lot of damage. We see him going towards the 4th base. But even though he has like, that's what, like around 20 Mutalisks, just having like 3 turrets here and a handful of Marines that are 2-2, by the way. These Mutalisks I think are only 2-0. So like, if Life tries to engage this, he's going to engage really cost inefficiently, and he doesn't want to do that right now. That's because he doesn't really have a bank. He's only on 4 bases, so he's trying to preserve his units and get as much damage done, taking as little as possible. So even though he probably would have gotten to deny this base, or done a lot more damage if he like floated over these units and like killed all the turrets and the Marines, he would have lost at least 5 to 6 Mutalisks. And if he had like 500 less gas and minerals, that would make his bank even smaller than Fantasy's. And so it's just not a good, it's not a good trade, and Life knows it, so that's why he doesn't attack into it. So now we see Fantasy, he's done a good job clearing this creep up. He did an initial scan over here with the Hellion Force at about 1230 to clear this side, and we can see it's like pretty low. It's not even connecting Life's 4th base to the rest of his creep highway. And then Life, or Fantasy, did another scan about a couple minutes later, about a minute before he pushed out in this area with his Hellion Banshee Force. And then he did another scan when he pushed out into this position as well, when his main army was over there. And now Fantasy, he did even another scan over here to kind of push back the creep in the middle of the map as well. So he's just doing a really good job of limiting the creep and denying life spaces. And that's kind of one of the good things about this unit composition against just a regular mutabailing style, is that Fantasy's unit composition is so strong that life can't even engage, like, Fee can't even engage, like, that's only half of Fantasy's army. He still has a small chunk over here and then a small chunk over here as well to be safe from counterattacks. And life can't even engage into this and clean it up with this muta bailing force that he has right now. And he's kind of just forced to go for these counterattacks and to try to limit Fantasy's economy, just like what Fantasy is doing to life. That's pretty much his best option here with the kind of units that he has. And so they're trading base for base. These banelings, that was pretty expensive. He lost a significant chunk of his army, whereas Fantasy, he's gonna lose almost nothing to clean up this base. Life, again, bleeding away a lot more banelings. It's really hard to defend these kinds of positions because you have the siege tanks on the low ground, and like Life has a good like 25 mutalisks, and there are 3 Thors and like 4 Marines, and Life is too afraid to fly over this force and try to clean it up with his mutalisks, because if he loses even half of his mutaforce, he's gonna have no bank to remax on anything because he has no economy right now. And like as soon as okay, so he's flying over, he's trying to do some damage, and let's just go back to see exactly how much damage got done. So like Life thinks, okay, I think I can take this. I have a lot of mutalisks. He only has 3 Thors. I can just magic box and get away with that, right? Wrong. And these Thors are only +1 attack as well, so they're not two-shotting mutalisks. And the Marines are still 2/2. So we see Life's mutalisk force is coming over to engage this army to hopefully clean it up. And if it was a regular mech force, I think it would have been cleaned up. The Thor gets a shot off against these mutalisks, does a decent amount, and Life kind of does. He messes up magic boxing as well, which kind of sucks. But he can't really not magic box, because if he spreads his units out too much, then the Marines are just gonna pick off the mutalisks one by one. And so he's engaging here. There's only 3 Thors and only a handful of Marines, but already he's lost a couple mutalisks. He's losing a couple more, and then on the retreat, he almost loses a bunch more. So that could have gone kind of better for him if he had magic boxed slightly better, and he's making 19 more mutalisks as well. So he's really committing heavily to this mutalisk count. So this is the kind of mutalisk count that you need to start like going in, sniping command centers, and then going out with minimal losses. So this is the time when mutalisks get extremely scary. But we're gonna see here exactly how Fantasy ends up dealing with this masked mutalisk style. So it seems like Fantasy is kind of just stopped siege tank production, and he's gonna be focusing a lot more on Thors. But the kind of minimum count that Fantasy always has in his army is about 5 siege tanks. I'll show that the next time they click on it. And then he always has that one. He just has that one siege tank at home to defend against counterattacks. Now these Thors are 2/2, by the way, so or 2/1. I mean 2/0, so they can two-shot mutalisks. Life, he's gonna go for a counterattack here because Fantasy's army is extremely out of position, and let's just see how much damage gets done from these Thors and Marines. So just like that, Life doesn't even want to engage at that angle because he knows that Fantasy's army is going to be close by, and he can't take an effective trade against 3 Thors and like 10 Marines. That it's not going to work. And Fantasy also has a siege tank in position to defend, so that like the Zergling Baneling force can't go in, and then the mutalisks can clean everything up. That can't happen because of what Fantasy's defense is. And then Fantasy or Life can't even engage against that. So the best choice he has is to deny this 4th base again. But as we see here, looking at the bank, Fantasy has engaged a lot better than Life. He has a much scarier army as well. Okay, so right now, Fantasy's moving out, Life is attacking the natural. This might be like a bad moment for Fantasy, it looks like, because Life kind of found a weak spot by having Fantasy's army out of position. He's doing a lot of damage, and it's all because Fantasy's army is out of position. So Fantasy's response to it is to immediately send a drop over to one of the bases because he knows the mutalisks are over here, and then to medevac boost these Thors over and get getting those couple extra shots off means that the Mutalisks are going to be weaker for a whole nother minute. So Life can't do these kinds of things without taking more significant damage. So like Fantasy has like he puts 4 Thors in the medevacs. Fantasy's army is way over here, and like he's able to like just get those Thors to where they are. If Life tried to fly into the main, the Thors would have been able to intercept them and get a bunch of shots off. And it's not like Life can even fly over the Thors and kill them because the Bioforce is right behind them, almost at, like just going at almost as fast of a speed as pre-ignite afterburners. And so Life is forced to back out, and he still takes a couple more Thor shots, and those even if he doesn't lose any Mutalisks, they get severely weakened as a result of that, and it really prevents Life's harass. Like, look at all those Mutalisks; they're very, very weak, and so he needs to wait at least another minute for them to regen up. And now Fantasy gets to move out because Life can't. Life's Mutalisks are on this side of the map. He can't like switch over here really fast. Oh, and I really like this. So now that Life has shown how much money he's invested in Mutalisks, Fantasy now just has these Thors on retainer to be able to swoop to any base nearby to kind of help defend himself against Mutalisks. And the reason why mass Mutalisks are not working very well here is because doing this build gives the Terran player the right kind of units to deal with Mutalisks, Thors, and Marines, and it also gives like there's units on the Terran side that are as fast as Mutalisks now. Stimmed Marines, almost as fast, pretty fast though. Thors in pre-ignite or in the medevac afterburners, they are as fast as Mutalisks now. So it really punishes Life. Like, he has to get out before doing a lot more damage and like sticking around and doing that extra pot shots here. And like, so he tries to do a counterattack because he saw that Fantasy's army, like, he had a bunch of Thors and his entire army was like over here. So Life was like, okay, I'm just gonna go around counterattack and try to do a base trade, and these Mutalisks are gonna do really well. Wrong. So if we take a look here, we see that Fantasy's let's go back a little bit more. So looking on the minimap, we see that Life's Mutalisks are over here. Fantasy's doing a drop on the other side of the map, which is really great. So Life cleans up the medevac drop over here, giving giving Fantasy a heads up that these Mutalisks are going to come into the third base or this area over here. And so immediately Fantasy starts to, like those Thors that were in the medevacs, he immediately speed boosts them back to his base. So they're over here on the minimap right now. The medevacs are right there where my mouse cursor is. And like, the Mutalisks, they're like still moving pretty fast, but just this ignite afterburners means that these Thors, so they're over here, they were way over here, and the Mutalisks, like, they're pretty fast units, and if the Thors just walked over here, they wouldn't have made it in time. But having this medevac support against these Mutalisks means that Fantasy doesn't even lose a single turret before those Mutalisks get the hell out of there, and Life even ends up losing a Mutalisk because of how fast the Thors were able to fire their shots. Or, not really how fast, but the long range that Thors have. So, like, that kind of Mutalisk defense, like, that's how you're never going to take any damage against Mutalisks ever again using this style. And that kind of means that going mass Mutalisks is not the answer in this matchup anymore against this kind of biomech style, which, like, normally it would work against just like Thor, Hellbat, Marine, and you'd be like scrambling all over the place, and you wouldn't be able to apply any pressure because you wouldn't have siege tanks. You just wouldn't, or you wouldn't have a big enough siege tank count. Your Thors and medevacs, like, you can't separate them off your army because you got to keep your medevacs together to kind of like keep your Bioforce alive. It's just a bunch of complicated factors, and it makes positioning a lot harder for you and a lot easier for the Zerg to abuse. So as we see here, Life has finally decided, like, this mass Mutalisk style is not working, and like, Fantasy has 1 Thor, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Marines that are 3/3 by the way now, so that they're gonna shred Mutalisks. it just takes a little force like this to scare away 20 plus Mutalisks. Like Life doesn't even want to try to engage into that. So Life, he's transitioning now. Fantasy does a double scan to kind of, he does a scan over here to check the rally point, like he's done. He scanned there a couple other times in the game to see what kind of unit composition Life is getting. It's very important to know what unit composition your opponent is getting so that you can build the right unit composition to counter it. And then he scans over here and sees that, okay, it's Zerglings, Ultralisks, and Banelings. Cool. How well are they going to do against my Siege Tank Thor Bioforce? Not too well, as we'll see in a little bit here. But Life, he's definitely running out of money. Fantasy has this important fourth base economy. He has an insane bank as well, so that if Life did try, like Fantasy can transition into some sort of Sky Tech right now. The only reason he isn't doing that is because it's not the right unit composition to build against this kind of a Mutalisk force and this kind of mobile ground force. After this force is cleaned up, then will be the right time to transition to Sky Terran. So again, Fantasy just cleaning up that force and kind of like just denying the bases. It's very important to limit Life's economy so that, like, even though Fantasy's trading really well, if Life has like 2 more bases than Fantasy, Life's still gonna win just by sheer numbers. So this battle right here, these siege tanks are completely, like, Fantasy's army is completely out of position here, okay? His siege tanks aren't even sieged up, and if you just watch this battle, it's just insane how poorly it went for Life. Like, yeah, he still has some Mutalisks left. They're kind of bruised, but Fantasy still has enough ground force on the ground, or enough of a force on the ground to deal with it. And not to forget this little group against the Mutalisks, they weren't even part of the fight. So Fantasy's entire army wasn't even part of that fight, and he still won it pretty single-handedly. He's up 20 supply right now. He still has a huge bank. So, like, this fight kind of just illustrates how freaking strong this army really is. Having the siege tanks out of position, having all of these units clumped up, it's pretty much the best kind of engagement that Fantasy or that Life can get right now. And yet, having just a handful of Marines and like 3 Thors in the back just really shuts down everything. Like, Life is even like, he's trying to focus down like one group of Fantasy's army because Fantasy had a little flank coming in, and Life is barely able to clean up that group of army, and he wasn't even able to touch the flank by Fantasy. Now he has to back off, otherwise losing both his Mutalisks and his Ultralisks. He sends the Ultralisks in just because they're gonna die anyways. So just how that battle went, having the siege tanks even unsieged and not having the entire army in Fantasy's army and still winning that battle really, really convincingly. He's up 30 supply now. Just shows the freaking brute force that this kind of army has against Muta, Baneling, Ultra. Like, if it was against a Bioforce, I'm sure it would have done a ton more damage, but just having this kind of a half and half gives the strength of mech, and like, you would never want to have Ultra Baneling against mech because mech is just going to roll that over. So having like this mech element and being able to switch into mech units to kind of just counter that unit composition just means you can, like, they just demonstrated in that last battle how freaking strong this army is and just how strong this style can be as well. So Life's last money is going into a Corruptor Broodlord switch. That's his last hope. I mean, Fantasy has only a handful of Marines. He has like 3 or 4 Thors in his army. He doesn't have any Vikings. So this Broodlord force might be able to catch him off guard. And like, he has a good amount of Queens and Infestors as well. So it's not like they're just Broodlords and you can just go into the army and snipe it off. And he also has Mutalisks as well. So immediately Fantasy's going to start his Sky Terran transition because, like, he has the bank and he also needs to pump out Vikings as soon as possible, starting Viking production. But that doesn't even matter. So their armies are basically the same right now, too. Fantasy has 0 Vikings in his unit composition right now. Life has a pretty scary army. He has a handful of Mutalisks, he has a couple of Fungals available, and he has a bunch of Broodlords as well. He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's like 6 or 7 of them. And let's see what happens. Fantasy doing a good job of keeping his Marines away from the Infestors to the Fungals. The Mutalisks just being completely useless because they do no damage against Marines and Thors. And Fantasy has enough. He just has an overwhelming force to just clean up this engagement. Like, this could not have gone any worse for Life. And Life had a pretty decent army. And Fantasy still won that without a single Viking in his composition. Just Thors and Marines were enough to deal with the Mutalisk Broodlord force. And then the Marauders and Siege Tanks kind of like chewed through the Broodlings too fast. And now Fantasy is up a significant amount of supply, and he's able to win this game. So that kind of brings the end to this part 1, I guess. What we see here is Life going, like, against this kind of biomech play. Life is doing a Mask Mutalisk Baneling style into Ultra Baneling Infestor into Corruptor Broodlord Infestor Queen. This is a very standard tech path that most Zerg players choose to do against traditional bio styles, like innovation styles, and we see a lot of success with it. But against this kind of like biomech style where you have a pretty big number of Thors and Siege Tanks that can deal with both the Mutalisks and even Ultra Baneling and even Broodlord switches without even having any Vikings. Like, it's just an all-round good force that we saw Life throw 3 different unit composition armies at him, at Fantasy's army, and Fantasy still made like the same units and was still able to take really good fights that were pretty cost efficient, even though he wasn't in the most perfect positions, and still win the fights. Like, I don't even know what to say. Like, you can basically A-move, and as long as you dodge the splash damage, you're gonna be fine. That's how strong this style is. And the next video, or the next part of this video, I'm going to be uploading them in parts because this is going to be very long, is going to look at another biomech style. Basically, each part is going to be an individual video, and we're going to see the differences between each style, such as like getting double armories in 1 engineering bay, getting 1 armory, 1 engineering bay. In this game, it was 1 armory and 2 engineering bays, how fast you switch into this kind of bio play after opening up mech, and just all sorts of that. So part 2 coming up shortly. Stay tuned.